Hello, this is a narration over my painting of a tiger in ArtRage 5. I decided to pretty much just stick to the reference that I found and not change it too much, only to add a little bit of stylization towards the end. Started off by using quite a small canvas, zoomed out to get the basic shapes in. I always find that zooming out at the start always helps me to just focus on the bigger picture. And the square canvas 2 is the best brush that I found in the custom brush section that you now have in ArtRage 5, because it tends to feel as much like, I've never used an oil brush, but a lot like the oil brush in ArtRage, and the blending feels very nice on it as well, and also it's got a nice texture to it. Just sticking to one layer, as always. I've got a first layer as the canvas color and then just a layer above it. Just blocking in the color, gradually reducing my brush down as I go along to add in a bit more detail. Because I'm zoomed out quite a long way, I could see immediately that things weren't quite in the right place, so as you saw, I used the transform tool. Adding in a bit of green there for the reflected ambient light, because obviously he's traversing through some kind of jungle scene. This is all very rough at the moment, the start of it, just to get things in there. I always tend to work like this, big blocks of colour, just throwing things in, mixing things up a little bit. And as I go along, the detail starts to emerge. The Canvas 2 brush and the main oil brush are really useful for doing this. We're just laying down paint, but also applying a little bit of blending as you go along. Now switch to the oil brush. At medium thinners and stiffness, I think at this stage I'm just playing around with the oil brush, because the canvas brush has its merit, but when you're blending out you do start to lose some of the lines a little bit, and I wanted to add these in. For example, on the tiger the stripes are very pronounced and they have sharp lines and sharp contrast, so I wanted to add this back in, which I started to lose a bit. Just started to push the thinners up so that the paint is translucent and doesn't overwrite everything I've done underneath so far. The details are really starting to come in now. Still pretty loose. If I zoomed in at the moment and had a look what's going on there, it would be look pretty messy. Switch to a palette knife, the flat palette knife, to do a little bit of blending and start to smooth things out. As you can see, it's going backwards and forwards between the lines and the blending and the detail. Gone back down to 0 thinners again. Wanted to apply some thick paint. I have in mind at this stage how I'm going to treat the fur. I just want to give a suggestion of fur at the moment, using the palette knives to pull the paint around. Later on I'll use a sticker spray to add a bit of extra detail in. Lots of detail on this face, lots of detail overall. It's quite a complicated subject. Had in mind where to put the eye. I don't think I was quite happy where the eye was. I think overall the shape of the face wasn't quite right. At this moment in time I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but later on I spot it and managed to correct it. starting to come together now. I can start to see the stripes and the patterns on the face more clearly. It's more pronounced. The lighting is starting to come together as well. I'm using a separate layer here for all the markings on the face. I don't always do this, but this was almost a special exception because I could add something in, all the markings, all the stripes, and toggle it on and off. Maybe dial down the opacity if I wasn't completely happy. And I didn't really want to put these marks on my single painted layer, as I wanted the ability to undo them or take them out if I didn't quite get them right. Just a little flip there to check that everything looks moderately decent. I think I'm fairly happy with what's on this layer. Once I'm happy with edits that I put on a layer, I merge down as soon as possible. I don't like working on a large number of layers. I don't bother naming any of my layers either, and I just can't be bothered dealing with a lot. I tend to just work traditionally as much as I can and only have extra layers on towards the end when I'm applying different effects or I'm experimenting. As you can see with this layer, it's pretty much all the stripes. Just merged down there because I was happy with it and I wanted to commit. At this stage I've got most of the shapes and colours in. I wanted to experiment a bit with the sticker brush and what added detail that could put in. This is a bit of experimentation. I go to my favourite Bear Fur sticker spray brush initially. That didn't really seem to work this time. I went on to the rough fur, which seemed to give me a more tigerish type effect. Not sure I was quite happy with it. As you can see, I'm toggling on and off. I have it on a separate layer so I can do that. Playing with the colour now using the gradient fill. This is the basic from the basic set of gradient fills. I don't use anything complicated usually. It's generally one colour to another if I'm playing around with light, as I am there. The teeth didn't look right and it took me a while to figure this out. It was quite awkward, the angle of the teeth and the shape of them. It took a while to figure out how they fitted into the head. And it was really a bit of trial and error with this. As you can see, I've created it on a different layer to toggle on or off. Wasn't quite happy with the way they were going. I think this is also related to the shape of the head. I still wasn't quite happy with that. Playing around with the lighting, straightforward gradient type radial, which is the one I use most of all, and a simple fill. Always looking to get a light established from one of the corners. I always feel it looks nicer that way. Back to the palette knife and oil brush, moving backwards and forwards to establish a bit more detail. I'm a bit more happy with the lighting setup of it now. There is more contrast between the darks and the light, and the light is bringing the focal point to the face, which is what I wanted. As you can see, I discarded that sticker layer, that experiment in texture. I still have an idea I want to do it, but I may have just brought it in a bit too early. I think I want to establish a bit more detail and a bit more suggestion of the fur using the palette knives. And this is where the soft palette knife comes in really useful, because you can make the brush size very small and pull the paint around, and the effect of that will turn it into fur or almost individual strands, but not so small as they don't fit in with the overall picture. And there's a lot of this going on. As you can see, I'm pulling things down and around, and this is what the reference is showing me as well. The fact that the hair and the fur are looking a little bit matted in certain places, and this is where paying attention to the reference is really important. I wasn't following it religiously, because if I did, I could spend hours upon hours upon hours on this, and I prefer to take shortcuts to finish my paintings. My paintings generally take 4 hours. I don't know why, but every single one seems to take 4 hours. That's just the way it is. And maybe I just get bored after a certain period of time. I don't always overwork things. I could spend hours and days on these things, but I prefer to take shortcuts to get things done. I have an idea in my head, not necessarily at the start, sometimes I do, but as I'm going through I get a feel for what I want to do, and at the end of it I'm generally fairly happy with what I've produced. Still adding in detail, focusing on the eye a bit more. The fur is starting to come to life now as I'm moving the paint around, switching between the oil brush and the palette knife, bringing out a bit more contrast, being a bit braver with my strokes. That's the key to a lot of painting, is to be brave with it and make the shapes really come out and the lines to be clearly defined and the colours to contrast well. I've zoomed in a little bit more than I usually do just to get the detail on the face there. I don't zoom in much at all on any kind of painting, only if it's something that I really need to get in at, maybe the glint of a light in an eye or something like that. But most of the time, again, I'm treating it as a traditional piece of painting where I stay fairly zoomed out most of the time, almost like I have a canvas or something in front of me which doesn't change too much. It gives me a good overall perspective of the painting, and I can see from a high level view what's going on and don't get too fixated on details. Still working on the fur at the moment. There is quite a lot to do. There is quite a lot of fur, but the suggestion there, all the flicks of the fur on the edges of the face and the contrast between the stripes and the fur overlapping is really starting to come out now. There is an element that I think that maybe I won't even need to do anything regarding textures later on, but I think that maybe I do. It may just add something. And again, adding textures in later on is just saving me from all that massive of rendering, so I could go through each single bit of fur, each single hair towards the end, but you know, I don't want to do that. I can't be bothered doing that. And actually, if you do a lot of that, you lose sight of your overall painting, and you can lose the impact of it, and it can just look a bit of a mess. But I just wanted a straightforward impact of a ferocious tiger coming out and looking painterly as it should do, because I'm using ArtRage. I didn't really want to get into every single hair because it wouldn't look right. I would just lose it. And this is what I'm always very careful of. I'm always very careful of losing a painting, and therefore I tend to abandon it, not before it's finished, but I just have an idea that I don't really want to work it on it anymore because I'll just do too much. I'm starting to think about the background and what I'm going to do for that. I tend to have a simple background most of the time, but I had an idea I may just try something a little bit more complicated using a sticker spray to add in some grass potentially, because I know I have a few sticker sprays that have that. Put in the important whiskers, which actually I almost forgot about, but fortunately I spotted them. And as you can see, the highlights are starting to come in now, which always adds a bit of sparkle, and is something that I always leave towards the end. I don't want to put it in too early because rendering over the top of them can take the impact away. Using the warp tool there to adjust the lower jaw, now that looks a lot better. As I said earlier, the jaw didn't quite look right, and I think that's why I struggled with the teeth a little bit, because the jaw was actually out of proportion, it was misshapen. And this can happen quite a lot, that if one aspect, especially in the portrait, if one aspect of the picture is severely distorted or not correct, then it can affect the drawing or rendering of other aspects, and you get yourself into a bit of a muddle. but fortunately I managed to spot that and it looks much better now. Sometimes you don't spot it until you actually do it and then go back and then see what the difference is. Sticker spray for grass. I've managed to find a grass sticker spray to add in. This is very much looking more like the reference, but I'm not sure if this is quite the way I want to go. This is experimentation at the moment. And of course, this is a great thing about digital art, the fact you can experiment a lot. And also creating backgrounds is much easier because you can create your initial painting on a single layer and create a layer underneath it. And this is the way I always focus on the major painting initially, with a very neutral flat background, and then later on towards the end I add in a very simple background underneath my main painting. As you can see, I've gone back to my trusty bear fur. I still have an idea I want to add it, but I think I need to be subtle with it. I was a bit overkill with my texture brush before. I think that's why the bear fur didn't work initially. It's a case of creating a new layer on an overlay and changing the brightness, usually between white, which makes things a bit more saturated and lighter, or between a dark colour, which gives me those shadows, which is what I'm doing there. So it's a balance of the two to bring out the form a little bit more. If I used all lights, then the whole form would be too flat. Toggling on and off, I'm not quite sure whether I like it yet, because I've introduced quite a lot of detail already with the palette knives. Here I'm playing around with some rim light, which I usually only use the airbrush for, put on maybe a colour dodge layer, because it seems to work best. It gives me that softness on the edges. Was going to have a few flowers possibly on the vegetation, and this again was very much like the reference, but I don't think that was really working. It may even take the focal point away from the face. This is what this is all about really. It's the tiger emerging from some dense undergrowth, and you want to be focusing on the face with this, and this is always important to bear in mind the focal point of your picture. As you can see there's some detail with the highlights which have just been added, and this was running ArtRage in the 32-bit version and using some Photoshop like filters, which I've managed to find which work really well with ArtRage, just to add a bit of variation. And I think it works really well to pull out those highlights and to add a bit of extra twist to it, and to make it look even more painterly as well. As you can see, the impasto effect is quite apparent there, which is really nice to have a look at. At this point I'm pretty happy with it, but there's something nagging in the back of my mind regarding that background that I'm not happy with. I want something bolder. This is very much like the reference, but I don't want it to look like this. I want it to be different, but I'm not quite sure what I want. I'll need to experiment a bit with this, I think. Overall details of the tiger I'm pretty much happy with. I'm just going to start really doing something radical, I think, on the background now. This is something I use quite a lot. I selected the layer contents there and inverted and then deleted away the background, because I think I merged down at that stage, so it was a single picture. Playing around with, I had no idea what I'm doing really, so I was trying some of the custom brushes to see whether there was anything that would just work. I'm very familiar with the sticker stuff, with the different sprays I have for the sticker brush, but not the custom brush, so this was my opportunity to experiment a bit. Had an idea, maybe some rain coming down or something. If in doubt, I go to one of two options, either the roller brush or just the paint tube, squirt out some paint and then blur it all in using the palette knife. And this is what I end up doing in the end. The key to this really, more than anything, was getting the colour right, and I think I got the colour right with the green. It's fairly saturated, but I wanted that, and this is where the paint tube comes in really useful with the blending. It looks really natural and painterly, and you're not overburdened with textual detail either, so it sits back nicely behind the focal point. I still wanted to preserve an element of lighting. As you can see, there's a slight vignette effect on the edges where it's slightly darker. Tidying up a little bit there, I think. Just cropped again, because I wasn't quite happy with things. I think I was trying to crop this bit of detail out that I wasn't happy with the bottom of his leg. There are little details sometimes in a painting that start to annoy you, and what I tend to do is I just tend to crop them out, especially if they're on the edges of the painting. Really getting into the details of everything now. I'm pretty happy overall. I wanted it to be a pretty bold painting. I wanted it to just come out and be very painterly as I could get. Again, as I said before, at this point, if I focus too much on the details, I could go through. There's some messy bits. As you can see, I'm zoomed in here, and there's quite a few things that look quite messy. I could go in and paint every single hair, but where would it stop at that point? It would just go on forever. I'd spend hours on it. So that's it. As you can see, I went for the real painterly look. There's lots of texture, there's lots of impasto there, and I think I got the desired effect based upon my initial Tiger reference. Okay, I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much.